Welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We are going to start this day off right with a fantastic panel, and we call this panel State of Play. We just told them, talk about whatever you think is important, whatever you think the audience would want to know. So hopefully you've got some questions for this panel. Hopefully you're excited, you're up early. Let me give a few introductions, some brief introductions about who we have, and then I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Cwalina. And first up is Chris. You'll see from Chris's bio that he's the global co-head of Norton Rose Fulbright's data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity group, and has unique experience handling complex cybersecurity attack and data breach investigations. But what you might have missed from Chris's bio is that Chris went from being a great client to being a great law partner, having begun his career in privacy as vice president and assistant general counsel at ChoicePoint, where he ran the company's privacy, compliance, ethics, and credentialing department. And he also worked in-house at Dow Chemical and at Bayer. This makes Chris ideal for this panel because, like a baseball coach who once played the game, Chris does for other teams what he did for his own team, which is to design and preserve customer relationships and minimize the likelihood and consequences of litigation and regulatory investigations and everything that happens during the life cycle of an IR. We are thrilled to have Chris here today. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks so much, Sean. Great to be here.
Next up is Avi Gesser. You'll see from Avi's bio that he is co-chair of the Data Strategy and Security Group at Debevoise in Plimpton, where his practice focuses on advising major companies on a wide range of cybersecurity and privacy issues. But what you may have missed is that Avi has a certain skill set that sets him apart from just about every other speaker today. You heard a little of it during his one big thing. He is an artificial intelligence legal expert, a skill set not just from his time as counsel to the chief of the fraud section in the criminal division at DOJ, but also throughout his career. Understanding AI can be critical for IR and has begun to revolutionize the way companies manage prevention, remediation, analysis, and is also a concept that every board really needs to understand, as explained in an article that Avi recently wrote covering the benefits, risks, and key aspects of AI compliance. Thanks for being here, Avi.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Next up is Meredith Griffanti, a veteran of the incident response forums. You'll see Meredith from Meredith's bio. She is co-head of FTI's cybersecurity and data privacy communications practice and specializes in cyber crisis management and work. But what you may miss is what makes Meredith a cyber expert is not just her vast experience counseling clients facing global cross-border cyber crises that carry significant reputational risks, but it's also that Meredith is one of the hardest working people in incident response and has a unique experience of probably no other panelists today. She was actually hired by Equifax as an employee to help manage crisis communications, to reposition Equifax, to transform this top technology company and industry leader and deal with the cyber attack consequences. She is the Ernest Hemingway of incident response, obviously a tough person and wartime correspondent who enjoys being in the line of fire and figuring out how to write about it. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you, John.
And next up is Ed McNicholas. And what you will see in Ed's bio is that he is the data privacy and cybersecurity co-leader at Ropes and Gray. But what you might miss is not just the scholarly works he writes on cyber and his role as a law professor at GW, teaching a course on cyber and data breaches, nor his expertise on big data and data analytics, which is critical for understanding how to guard against ransomware attacks or the hundreds of data breaches he has worked on. But it's also Ed's crisis management skills that set him apart. He is responder, remediator, and fixer during an IR, a sort of unique composite of Clint Eastwood, Hawkeye Pierce, and Harvey Keitel, except without all the illegal stuff for Harvey Keitel. I was recently talking to a friend of mine at a major forensic firm, and I asked him about IR and attorney-client privilege, and he said, we're on it. We had Ed McNicholas come by the other day to talk to everyone. We are all set. We are so excited to have someone of your stature on this panel. Ed, welcome.
Great to be here.
And finally, last but not least, is my former colleague from our time together at Strauss Friedberg, Sam Rubin, the Gil Grissom of incident response. Sam's bio says he is vice president at Palo Alto Networks in their elite Unit42 group. but that title does not reflect the fact that Sam's expertise in cybersecurity risk management, digital forensics, and data incident response is just quite simply as good as it gets. He is one of the few today who not only can lead an incident response, but he can also perform all the forensic work himself, the malware reverse engineering, whatever it is you need, which is why he has probably served as an expert witness more than anyone else you will hear from today. And he is really sought after in that capacity. So thanks for being here, Sam, and welcome.
Thank you, John.
Excellent. All right, Chris, take it away. Looking forward to hearing everything you guys have to say.
Well, why was my intro so boring? Like these guys had awesome like names and everything, and then mine was just blah. John, you need next year. You're going to have to step up on mine.
Chris, I'll put it this way: you are the Bruce Springsteen of incident response. So I just didn't want to. I know how humble you are.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, thanks everybody. We really pleasure to be here. We have an amazing panel with tons of experience, and these guys here and gals on the panel have worked on some of the largest incidents that have occurred over the last year and headline making incidents. So we're really lucky to have the talent on this panel. Want to say right out of the gates, we're gonna throw out a couple topics for the panel to talk about, but we really do want questions from the group, because this is really to kick off the day. So please do fire away the questions. I'll be looking at the questions. Already see one that's come in on the new CISA Act related to critical infrastructure reporting. We'll get to that for sure, but keep the questions firing. So to start us off, obviously, topically, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the geopolitical situation that's occurring. Obviously, a lot of news about increase of cyber attacks and threats to critical infrastructure, threats to the United States, threats to allies in the region. So Russia-Ukraine conflict, first topic, and just want to tee up, I guess, Sam, I'll start with you just from a security infosec perspective. What are you seeing, your company seeing, your clients seeing in terms of this conflict? Any uptick, really wide open discussion here about what you're seeing? Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So Unit42 has quite a large threat intelligence team. So a group that's every day just keeping an eye on what's going on out there by way of the telemetry that Palo Alto Networks has from its global firewalls and other products, as well as communication with our peers and former colleagues in government and so forth. And we stood up a war room related to the conflict, related to what's going on in Ukraine, really back in January, to keep an eye on it. The spillover in terms of the cyber threat. And the big concern from our standpoint is what cyber tools and tactics used over there could make their way out, a la what happened 2017 in terms of that activity. So we're seeing, for example, a lot of wiper malware strains being used, at least 7 to 8 different strains with names like Acid Rain, and so forth. We're seeing a lot of DDoS activity and botnets. Very notably, there was the takedown a couple of weeks ago of the Cyclops Blink botnet by the FBI. And that activity, that botnet, was attributed to a Russian group known as Sandworm. Most recently in the news, very, very relevant, was this InDestroyer malware, which was thwarted, but targeting Ukrainian electrical systems, again, attributed to the Sandworm threat actor group. So a lot of activity. We have not seen a lot yet spill out or over to United States organizations. One exception to that is Viasat, the US satellite company, did have some disruption related to activity in Central and Eastern Europe. But of course, as CISA has warned, and we're all sort of keeping our eyes peeled, we are looking for other sort of retaliatory activity, that could spill out from what's going on.
Yeah, the destructive stuff is pretty pretty scary, as we all know from the uptick in ransomware cases. If they start moving into, instead of copying data, just wiping out systems, that's when it gets can get real interesting. Avi, how about you? Anything to add to this topic?
Sure. So we're certainly seeing an uptick in ransomware activity. I think the combination of the increased disclosure requirements for cyber and for ransomware in particular, and the increased complexity of the sanctions risk now, especially with Russian ransomware groups, I think is just making it much harder to pay ransom. Is one of the sort of takeaways of this. I think the reputational risk has changed. Groups like Conti have shown strong affiliation with the Russian government, which has created enormous reputational risk if you end up paying them. And so we have clients who are in situations where I think it would have been an easy call a year ago to pay a ransom, now struggling, having vendors who are not willing to get involved because they're worried about potential sanction risk, and knowing that the payment is likely to become public and what that may do in terms of increased regulatory scrutiny. I think that's all creating an environment where people are focused much more on resilience and being able to avoid having to make a payment because the calculus has changed.
Sam, someone just raised where they can read more about recent incidents that you discussed. So here's a chance to plug your threat intel.
Yeah, Unit42, our TI team, publishes several times a week a blog on unit42.paloaltonetworks.com, and we have a whole section focused on the conflict in Ukraine. So a lot of detail focused on the threat actors, the TTPs, the different malware strains and things we're seeing over there. So I definitely check that out, and maybe we can throw that URL in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if you can, but go for it. Avi, great point about the change in that you're seeing from a client perspective, struggling more with this ransom payment situation and how things have changed a bit. Ed, you seen same type of thing happening in your practice?
No, I want to make a positive point coming out of this, which is kind of odd. But 5 years ago, when you wanted to brief a board of directors on cyber, there was a lot of, how much time do you need? Is a half hour enough? Do we really need to talk to the board about this? How about the committee? Now, boards of directors are ravenously hungry for briefings on cyber. With the SEC rules and the Ukraine coming together, it is creating an environment in which we are getting into the boardroom on cybersecurity issues easily. In fact, being overwhelmed by requests to talk to boards of directors, do tabletops with boards of directors. And so I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict has raised awareness in a way that, presentations are just not going to do. And so there's some good coming out of it. Also, I want to just say, it's not like the Russians aren't shooting at us. It's just that the defenses are holding. So yes, the Russians are doing an incompetent job. They're not as good as we thought they were. But I think the defense is holding really well, and the coordination is coming together. So I think part of this is, wow, it's working. We've been planning for something like this in a lot of different environments, in the government particularly, and it's very impressive that the defenses are holding.
Meredith, how about you from a comms point of view?
Yeah, agree with everything that Avi and Ed said. And just to build on what Ed said a little bit in terms of boards paying attention and in terms of preparedness, I think a lot of our critical infrastructure companies and financial services clients are assuming that, it's not a matter of if, but when, or they're already in systems, and it's just a matter of who blinks first. But they're really taking the preparedness plan seriously in terms of, getting organized, getting work streams in place, figuring out how information would flow between those work streams and how to most effectively respond to a potential incident. So I do think that's another benefit, as Ed said, coming out of this situation.
I got one question from someone in the audience who says that they're a security professional, also a lawyer, and how do they break into sort of the law firm space? I can tell you with a significant tech experience. Well, one simple answer is give me a call. Would love to have you. But Ed and Avi, that I think you probably would agree with me. I mean, you know, our practices are becoming much more technically oriented. We're in the weeds, in the trenches with the folks like Sam and sits shoulder to shoulder with them. Avi, would you agree with that? And maybe you're another person that they should call too.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, you know, having lawyers who are, you know, not afraid of jargon and can absorb technical information is becoming incredibly valuable, and that's cyber, privacy, AI, big data. I mean, all of it. And it's not as though, I mean, my background's in chemistry, but you know, if you're technically savvy and you're not afraid of, you know, learning technical stuff as a lawyer, I think 2022 is like a great year to really deepen those skills in combination, because I think that's sort of what everyone is looking for right now.
Oh, I agree with that, Ed. Same with your firm.
You know, I think there is a couple different approaches. Some law firms are really focusing on the legal piece of it and sticking to that lane, and others are trying to broaden out and become consultancies. I know we're taking the approach. My approach from my team is to stick to the legal piece of it and not compete. When I have technical questions, I look to folks like Sam. And call friends at, you know, Mandiant, Strauss Friedberg, Palo Alto, because they're going to be further up the chain. And so I think that's probably, some firms are broadening and some firms are going narrow and specializing. So there's some difference in strategy there.
Let's shift to trends in attacker TTPs, techniques, et cetera, and types of attacks. I mean, you talked a little bit about that, Sam, in the beginning, but what are you seeing that's new over the past year in terms of evolving TTPs, evolving types of trends in attacks?
Sure. So the perspective here comes from really from our boots on the ground work. Our incident response team does right around 1,000 incidents a year, give or take, helping organizations respond to cyber events that escalate beyond, you know, what they want to handle themselves from a scope and impact standpoint or legal risk when, you know, outside counsel like you all are brought in. But in terms of what we're seeing, Chris, there's really three trends I wanted to hit. One of them is the increased sophistication and the increased use of 0 days. Several years ago, and you know, this is not just last year, but I'd say sort of an evolving trend. Several years ago, there was kind of like two camps. You know, in the e-crime realm, it was really leveraging, you know, vulnerabilities that should have been patched and other sort of weaknesses that cyber hygiene could take care of. And then on the APT, or advanced persistent threat side, it was much more aligned with, you know, 0 days and these sophisticated techniques. There's an incredible blurring where the e-crime groups, like Conti, we mentioned, Revol is another one, are using 0 days. Last summer, for example, Revol, you know, hit a lot of the headlines, and we helped a number of customers out, number of clients out with a 0-day vulnerability in Kaseya, which is remote access software. It was really notable then because, you know, this is using remote access to push out from managed service providers to multiple victims simultaneously through this remote access software. And then they could use this as a ransomware deployment mechanism. Another example of that is Log4j, where, you know, the 0 days announced, and almost immediately, you know, we're seeing in our telemetry millions of scans across the world globally where threat actors are looking for customers or companies that haven't yet patched. And of course, companies are still working to do that. So that's one trend, is this sophistication. Another one is the ransomware as a service explosion, really just lowering the technical bar and opening the door for others to participate, which has really led to the rise in ransomware, across the world. Third, which I know we'll talk more about, I'm sure, is just multi-extortion techniques with ransomware. In the olden days, ransomware just meant locked up files. And when we did forensics, looking at victims' systems, we wouldn't see artifacts that indicated access to or exfil of sensitive information. It was really, they get in, they lock up files, they make a demand, and they're out. Now, I mean, it's just as common and becoming even more common that they're in for some time, they're taking information, and then they're doing a lot of, and they're putting it on leak sites, and then going much further, threatening customers, threatening employees, bringing in DDoS to shut down systems with distributed denial of service. So really an escalation of these multi-extortion techniques. Those are the three trends, I think.
Well, and we're seeing that as well from our point of view. You've hit on the trends I think everybody is seeing. Avi, I'm going to ask you, in light of the these developments, and I'll just pick on a couple. The ransomware as a service model, which brings unpredictability. The year or two ago, where you've got this group, and this group, lots of stats about each group. You know what they do, you know how they do it, you know their reliability is with respect to payment and default once you reach a settlement. Now you've got this ransomware as a service stuff. Now you've got people acting incredibly aggressively. We've seen threats to family, bomb threats, all kinds of crazy stuff. How do these things, and then in light of the sanctions issues in that part of the world, are these things translating into your practice and how your clients are thinking about these payments? And is the stuff on the one hand outweighing the potential risk on the sanctions?
Yeah, I know it's a much more complicated landscape, right? It used to be you show up and you're like, "Hi, I'm Ryuk, and this is what I do," and everyone's like, "Oh, okay, we can pay these guys," or whatever. Like now, you're not even sure who you're dealing with or whether they're part of a much broader group, and somebody in that group could have servers in Iran or be sanctioned in some way, and it just means you've got to get a really sophisticated team together very early, and that's ransomware negotiator, forensic group, FBI, everybody together to sort of figure out what do we know about this group, what can we say? Because if you don't know who you're dealing with, you really can't pay. I mean, from a whole bunch of reasons, sanctions risk, plus just like reliability and so forth. So all that moves much quicker. And what that really means is you got to have that all lined up ahead of time. You got to know who, if something happens, who would that team be, and are they, ready to go, retained under contract? Do you know who the FBI, liaison would be? Do those people know who's in charge of which group in which office? Because all that stuff is now harder to do. You need to do it quicker, and it's always a tough decision. But I mean, we've seen companies pay not because they absolutely had to pay, but because sort of their time ran out before they really were able to get their hands on all this stuff and really understand it. And I think there's now a huge premium to bring in outside expertise as quickly as possible.
Oh, all good points. Ed, from your point of view, how are these new tactics, aggressive tactics, et cetera, changing your practice or impacting your clients?
I would agree with Avi. There's a premium on preparing. People are getting ready in advance. They are thinking hard about what it would take to rebuild their systems and thinking about how strong their backup strategies are. The other thing that's really been moving around is the insurance market and the role of insurance in paying for these ransoms. Some companies are saying, well, we didn't think we needed insurance and we're going to go get it. Others are rethinking because the insurance markets have shifted seismically. It's much harder to get coverage. The premiums are much higher. The towers of coverage are much lower. And so a lot of companies that I've seen are actually moving away from having insurance, in part because they don't want to put out on their SEC filings that they have insurance. The thought being that if they put out to the market that they have insurance, they're kind of putting their hand up and saying, hey, if you hit us, we will have money to pay you. And so is it a better strategy not to advertise that you have insurance for ransomware? It's a very complicated scenario right now of how the markets will respond to the insurance markets, will respond to the attackers, will respond to the companies and the disclosure requirements.
Meredith, I'm going to come to you on this topic because I mean, you could talk all day about communications and how these trends have impacted communication strategies. And I know you've worked on some of the most public cases that have occurred of late, and some of which I've worked with you on. How does this straight data extortion technique from threat actors stealing data, extorting non-publication? We've got the rise of lapsus that has become quite prominent in the news. From a communication standpoint, can you talk about how companies are? Last thing I'll say before I just to tee you up one more point, I guess, before you start talking, is from what I've seen from my chair, from my point of view, comms is one of the hardest things to deal with in a ransomware case, in a data extortion case. We're going to talk about the regulatory changes in a minute, but it is one of the most, I think companies don't appreciate actually how much prep and work should go into being ready for communications issues prior to an attack. In any event, what is your view?
Oh, it's a good point. I agree with you. I think it's, everyone's focused on the legal ramifications, the forensic investigation, and then they forget, their customers, their investors, the media, their employees are really their most important stakeholder groups that need to be considered and built into any type of communications plan. I would say with regard to your question on, just the trend with straight data extortion, the rise of lapsus, we've worked on quite a few lapsus incidents. Without the notion of encryption and the lever to pull on a payment for the decryptor tool, the getting the payment for the data exfil is really all they have. So we're seeing them, as Sam mentioned, try to make that extortion process as painful as possible, be it emails, outreach to customers, threatening notes to employees, phone calls to employees. Chris, you mentioned threats to families, DDoS, and we're seeing all of that really come to a head. And of course, those kind of things put the company at risk for a leak, and they need to be prepared to kind of take control of the narrative and talk about what's happening in a really well thought out and strategic way that's not only in lockstep with the legal strategy, but that doesn't get ahead of the forensic investigation, right? Where you have to say something that you then need to walk back later. That's typically the number one thing we try to avoid. And then the other thing is, with double extortion ransomware with encryption, you can typically buy time in your negotiation strategy right before the incident goes public, because you're negotiating price, whether or not you have an intention to pay. But with lapses, with other groups, they're not giving you that opportunity, right? Because they're posting almost immediately on public channels, be it Telegram or social media, or calling the media directly, as we've seen in some of our cases. And they're making this public before a demand is even made of the company, which really forces their hand and makes them need to get out ahead of this and reach out to customers. And I think emphasize that it wasn't a ransomware attack. From a customer perspective, they're worried about, malware spreading, having to disconnect from systems. So I think highlighting, what didn't happen in the case is sometimes just as important as what did happen. So, and I think the other thing we're seeing lapses and other straight data extortion groups do is a focus on IP and source code and talking about, the sensitive things they were able to steal from the company, and being able to work with your forensic team to talk about why that maybe wasn't so important, not necessarily litigating it in the press, but working with the team, working with legal counsel to talk to customers about why their products and services are still protected. Just some things we're seeing from the comms perspective.
Well, you get hit from all angles, right? When companies get hit, and I think that's again, I was referencing. I think companies underprepare there. I think a lot of companies are doing tabletops, which we could talk about that. By the way, the value of tabletops versus other prep exercises, which we're a proponent of, but the prep that could go into comms, I think, is lacking, and I think we see our clients not be prepared for sort of the onslaught that they get from the various audiences, and so that's an area I would just flag for folks that you should spend more time and attention, and don't assume because you've got great comms people in your corporations, because they all do, that you're ready for a crisis like a significant ransomware case. I've got some questions coming in, so I'm gonna pause to address hit some of them right now. One of the questions, Sam, I'm gonna come back to you. You mentioned a few parties that you want to be have at the ready. What really anybody can answer this question in terms of the battle box. It was the question in the case that an incident does occur. So who are those third parties, Sam, that you need to have sort of relationships with and ready? And while you're thinking of that, I will raise a lot of chatter about FBI. FBI has divisions across the country associated with particular threat actor groups. So we think it's important that you work with the division that is specializing in the particular threat actor group, if known at that time. So I'll just add that. But Sam, who are the third parties you need to be ready to pull the lever on in the event of an incident?
Yeah. So Chris, in what context? I think it does depend. I will say having your an understanding of your capabilities internally is key, right? So organizations, and it doesn't matter how mature from a kind of like revenue perspective. We've seen publicly traded companies with low maturity and startups with incredibly sophisticated cyber capability. But knowing just sort of where you are on that spectrum is key, and what your capability is internally versus when you need to go get outside help. That's what's key, and what your escalation path and protocol is in the context of responding to an incident. And so having a trusted advisor team of digital forensics and incident response like Unit42, outside counsel like Ed, Avi, and Chris, communications like Meredith. I mean, we're checking off a lot of the boxes here. If the thrust of the question was a little bit more on the technical side related to DDoS specifically, there it's communication with your ISP. A lot of them have protocols in place to help with things like that, as well as with your network provider. Palo Alto Networks has some capability in that regard, as well as companies like Cloudflare. So there's a lot of different angles to that question, but it takes some time and some forethought for sure.
No, that's good. That's good, Sam. And let's shift to the regulatory landscape, because lots of changes there. So let's talk about that. Ed, I'll start with you. A lot of activity around new reporting requirements, stringent timing reporting requirements. What say you?
Well, a couple things are going on. One, we are reaping the harvest of this whole of government approach, as opposed to administrations. And I think this is a bipartisan thing. As opposed to administrations setting up real leadership in the federal government, we said every agency can move forward, and every agency has. We have TSA, DOL put out regulations on ERISA fiduciaries. It's hard to imagine an agency who's not put out a cybersecurity regulation. And so we have every agency moving forward on cyber, and they're not all that coordinated. So we have that complexity. If you deal with a company that is across multiple sectors of the economy, wow, you can have a whole bunch of different regulatory bodies. The one that's getting news right now is the Securities and Exchange Commission. They've put out new rules on registered investment advisors that complemented Federal Trade Commission rules on private equity funds. And we've also got the SEC putting out public company reporting rules. One of the themes that comes out is that everything's got to be done really fast. The Europeans said 72 hours. When they said 72 hours, people said, that's because they don't have incident response in Europe. They don't, what can you possibly say in 72 hours? This is ridiculous. Well, we're one-upping them. It's 48 hours, 36 hours, 24 hours, pick your regulation. And it is a situation where, okay, fine, we're going to have to go to regulators very early on, different thresholds and all that. Of course, once you go to one, you kind of have to go to the others. So it's going to be a question of the lowest common denominator is going to trigger. You go in, talk to the regulator, but then there's this question of, particularly with the securities piece, if you have to file an 8K, you do something publicly, then you have this issue of you're making a public statement that's affecting your securities. And if that's wrong, or even if it's not entirely correct because you don't know everything yet, the securities fraud bar will be right on you along with the SEC. So I think that the kind of the rise of the securities regulatory piece and the securities fraud derivative action piece of this is going to be driving a lot of it. Avi and I, our firms are both in the SolarWinds case, where we've got securities fraud cases in a securities fraud case in Texas, derivative action in Texas, derivative action in Delaware, all from the same incident. It's a new world in terms of the consequences for a data breach.
Yeah, the reporting requirements across multiple industries is changing. To be sure, Avi, a House Oversight Committee report related to the some cases that I know folks on this panel worked on regarding reporting breaches to CISA. You got the CISA Act for critical infrastructure. Anything you want to add to the regulatory environment?
Yeah, I mean, I just think like your incident response plan now needs to have like a whole regulatory communications piece to it, because, you know, you could go 48 hours without the InfoSec people even escalating it outside of their group, you know, and then the deadline's pass and, you know, no one's even heard of it. I mean, there needs to now be like a checklist of all the possible notification obligations with the deadlines and who's responsible for making that notification and what approvals are needed, because, you know, 48 hours, 72 hours goes by incredibly quickly. And if you blow through your deadline, you know, you're just in a much more difficult spot with the regulators. And, to Meredith's point, like there's a ton of communications going on. So you've got internal communications to employees, maybe you've got external communications to customers, maybe you're notifying the board. Now you've got, you could have 8 or 9 regulators who you're going to be talking to in the first 72 hours. The message discipline there is incredibly hard to keep, like to say the same thing to everybody, because, we've had companies who, after the fact, the regulators come in and then look at what was said to everybody and start picking apart. Well, you told this person this, you told that person, in the heat of the moment, right? It's not necessarily that anyone's trying to play games, just it's very hard to get coordinated. Facts are coming in, they're being superseded. People have different confidence, right? You may know something, but how strong it is that you know it at that time can change dramatically, right? Like just because that's a fact today doesn't mean it's going to be a fact tomorrow. It's going to be as significant. So this whole piece of comms and disclosure and so forth used to get delayed. You dealt with it, after the first couple of days when you really things settled, then you turned to notification and comms and so forth. Now it's all happening at the same time, which makes it much, much harder to be coordinated and be effective.
So Meredith, obviously you're getting teed up nicely here, so I don't need to do it, but just, how does this change? How does this stuff change from your point of view in terms of a comms approach? I mean, there's always this debate we have, about what you say and when you say it. So talk about that.
No, I mean, Avi, you kind of took the words right out of my mouth, and in terms of having an entire regulatory section be part of your incident response plan and your kind of crisis communications playbook as it pertains to cyber. I think your point on making sure within the company who knows which roles and responsibilities are on point for notifying, who their contacts are, keeping all of that up to date as things unfold, making sure that there's sort of a central clearinghouse for messaging so that everything is consistent. And that's evolved all together at the same time as you're speaking to different stakeholder groups is so important. And I think that the roles and responsibilities portion of the playbook is the thing that kind of tends to get decided in the heat of the moment when you're dealing with a live incident. And then you're just playing a game of who's on first, who's tracking. And that's, I see us kind of coming in to play that role more often than we probably should. Chris, I know we've worked on quite a few incidents together where that's happened. And Avi, I've worked with Debevoise and Luke and the team quite a bit as well in similar situations. And it's lucky that we're usually all on the same page and we can kind of give the client good counsel on the importance of being consistent. And even though they might have these really tight relationships with regulators or lawmakers, there's a tendency for them to want to go share a little more detail in some cases, given personal relationships. Same things with clients too, right? And it's really that message discipline that is so important. I mean, we've had cases, I know Chris and I have, where Congress has come back and asked for records of text messages, emails, and is doing exactly what Avi said and comparing notes on who knew what when. So completely agree with everything you said. And Chris, that's it for me.
Sam, I got a question. Can you speak more to what actually constitutes the start of a timeline? And to that, I would say, well, that's why I get paid and have a job. But it isn't simple. There are different definitions for triggers. Sam, are you guys, from your point of view, you will have monitoring detection capabilities in clients that you help protect. You have severity level classifications, characterizations, escalations based on SAME. Are you all talking more to clients about who gets reported what incident based on what severity level? Are you having these discussions at all in light of these sort of reporting changes and requirements? Are those conversations happening more where you're seeing more connection between legal and the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 people? Just curious, is this coming up in your practice?
Yeah. So I think one of the, I don't know if it's a dirty secret, but I think that sometimes the, outside counsel and even outside digital forensics and incident response firms forget what really goes on inside the security operations group at any large organization, right? Any large organization that has a SOC, they're seeing millions of alerts come in, yearly across, their firewall at the network level, alerts pop up on endpoints, whether it's some benign malware or something. And so this is what the SOC team is doing every day. And their job is to triage these alerts. And many of them will call them incidents. I know that sort of raises a red flag for this group, but it's not necessarily an incident that raises to the level of, there's been a disclosure of sensitive information or even access to it. And so that's where this gray fuzzy area comes in, is when does the SOC team, which is designed to largely be self-sufficient, need to say, okay, this is different. This isn't something that I want to handle myself, and I need to, notify the GC's office, need to potentially get outside counsel or call, break glass and call my incident response, call up on my retainer customer. So yes, we have those conversations, and really, the best way to figure it out is by practicing it, right? Through tabletopping, through simulated attack, breach attack simulation, go through a ransomware attack with them. And that's how you get the muscle memory, but it is a really tricky thing to get right.
Well, this is why, in our practice, we are connecting more to security operations centers and really partnering as lawyers with the analysts and really thinking through the reporting obligations from a technical and legal sort of marriage. I got a great question, that points out that in a lot of cases, in tons of cases, and Sam, you're talking about this. I mean, you've got unauthorized access, you've got some activity, you've got something that has to be vetted, and you have to determine whether something is a false positive or whether there really is potential harm to systems, something more than just possible. That goes to it, right? I mean, this idea that the government and these regulations are requiring reporting on a regular basis, there is vetting that is needed, right? And that's where your team comes in, working with the security operations centers, and then of course plugging in attorneys to figure out what should be reported, because often there isn't a reporting requirement. So in terms of question here is a good one, which is when companies use third parties to assist them. And so when you have, so again, maybe Sam, you can talk about this. When you have third party companies assisting with your monitoring and detection capabilities, does that impact the company's decision to make these reporting decisions?
Right. So we're talking now about whether it's MSSP, managed security services provider, or an MDR, managed detection and response, which is a little bit more threat focused and has a little bit more response expertise. And when this can be hard, it can add a layer of complication because you have different parties involved. But when it's done right, what it's really doing is it's sort of outsourcing some specialization and some expertise to people whose job it is to have 24/7 eyes on glass. Continuous monitoring is part of a robust InfoSec program. And a lot of organizations don't have the people, the time, or the resources to do it themselves. And so it adds a great capability, but that it does raise a little bit of complexity about, again, what is their escalation protocol? Does it align with your needs from a regulatory standpoint, or how you're protecting your IP? And so it's important that you have those conversations with your provider. But when it's done right, they add capability that you may not have yourself.
Ed and Avi, we're running out of time, but I want to come back to you guys on this SEC thing real quick. Something we've noticed, I'm sure you have too, with 10K reporting. Are you now talking to your clients about hey, let's look at our disclosures, let's look at our risk factors, let's be less hypothetical in terms of, hey, we might have an incident, and being more sort of, hey, we deal with this stuff every day kind of thing? Are you now, in light of this, telling folks to look at their disclosures with a new lens?
Ed? We have these services that pull similar risk factors, so you can look at 100 different companies and how they're doing risk factors. The market is shifting to more detail. It's shifting to disclosure of specific incidents. Unfortunately, if you look at the securities fraud actions, your risk factor is only going to get you so far. If there's a breach, you're probably still going to get sued for saying that they're going to allege that something in there is not enough or is misleading. So I think, you can do more on risk factors, but it's not going to solve the problem.
Avi, how about you?
Yeah, and look, the new rules, if they come in as drafted, are going to require a lot more detailed disclosures about your policies and your procedures, and including things like the expertise of board members on cybersecurity and how often they're briefed. I mean, it's quite detailed, and plus updating on incidents. You're going to have like these ongoing reporting 10K, 10Q obligations on your incidents, and so we've been telling companies that the expectation is going to be a lot more transparency about incidents, and hopefully that will cause the market not to freak out about any particular incident. But there's going to be a transition period where the market is going to start getting a lot more information, and it's going to be very unclear how it's going to react. And companies are going to have to change the way they think about disclosure of not only their cyber events, but also their procedures and their risks.
That's the one thing, is that it's actually broader than just personal data now. That's one of the big shifts, is that the SEC is making it broader than personal data and taking it out to real cybersecurity risk. So it'll be interesting.
I'm going to wrap up with one comment. I see Bruce coming on. Another point raised about SOC activities. I would just say that to me, this is where the rubber meets the road in these cases, is the connection between your securities operations center, whether you have hybrid, whether you outsource. What we can tell you is that's where the mistakes are made. Typically in these incidents, there are not one, but many instances where the attacker path should have been stopped in its tracks, but wasn't. Why? Because of people and process failures. when we get our hands on those contracts and we look at responsibility culpability, we find them almost always lacking in clarity and responsibility. So I did want to add, to me, that is one of the most important things that you could focus on in this space. Bruce, listen, I wanted to thank everybody. This is a great panel. Bruce, as you could see, we could talk for a longer time. Great experts on this panel. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Bruce.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great way to start the day, and just a great look at the state of play, exactly what we needed. So Meredith, Avi, Ed, Sam, Chris, thank you again. And we will be back with our next panel, which is going to cover supply chain related cyber attacks. That'll begin at 9:40 a.m. We'll see you back here in a few minutes.